Well, welcome everybody. And to those of you watching the recorded version at home or live, welcome to everybody. So, tonight's topic may not sound that interesting just because the way it's worded, but I think you might find this intriguing and may give you some insight as to how to train more efficiently and really what training is all about. Tonight, we're going to discuss the history of periodization and training technique. Now, I know that sounds really dull, but here we go. Let me share my PowerPoint presentation, and I hope that you enjoy our discussion tonight. Here we go. Good. Again, thanks everyone for coming today. And here we go. If you have a body, you are an athlete. Remember that. You're all athletes. Um, that's my little thing, the book that I wrote. And okay, so we're going to talk about, like I said, periodization and specificity. I'll explain that. Some of this we had very early season. So now that we've gone through the season, you'll kind of see how it worked out and see the theory, but hear the theory behind it. The best time to change groups when you're changing, going to a faster group. The importance of taper throughout the entire season and toward the end of the season, which we're about to hit in 1 week, for 1 week and 3 days, a week and 3 days, we hit our final taper. But throughout the season, you want these interval tapers. They're so critical. And then, of course, like I said, the history of periodization and our question and answer. So here we go. Periodization is basically doing different things that accomplish different things during different periods of time. For an example, the first half of the season is mostly aerobic, meaning low heart rate work, building, fat burning as a resource for fuel. That's the low heart rate work we do. And then the second half of the season, we have more race pace and faster. What we also call race pace, what we might call specific training for the actual race, meaning marathon race pace, or what we also call specificity, which I mentioned just a moment ago. And then we have, like I said, this exponential taper at the very, very end. So those are periods of things that we do to achieve different objectives. Now, as we discussed months ago in several occasions, you build 3 weeks and then you taper a week down to 40, 50% less than your last peak week. Then you build a couple more weeks and taper, same thing, 40 to 50% less than the last week. Then build and taper, build, and then you finally have your final exponential taper at the very, very end. And that's kind of the way it works. And as you're building up more and more, your hormone levels are going down and down and down. Whoops. And as your volume goes down, your hormone levels come back up to full. So your hormone levels are kind of zigzagging in opposition to the exercise energy output, right? So the very, very end, when you're plummeting downward, your hormone levels, your energy levels, your ability because of hormones to rebuild muscle tissue is now just skyrocketing upward. So you're gaining strength and ability and energy so that race day, when you hit race day, your energy and your strength is on full. Your ability to rebuild muscle tissue is on full. That's the benefit of taper at the very, very end and throughout the whole season. Okay, we had that before. Specificity or specific training, like I said, we go from general training, you looking at this object here, as you go down throughout the season, more and more progression throughout the days and the weeks and the months of your season. You go from a lot of general training to less general training and less specific training to more specific training, meaning early season, you could like ride a bike up a hill and you build quad strength, all well and good. But by the end of the season, you really want to do more marathon race pace or more half marathon race pace, all of that stuff that's more specific to the race that you're about to do. And you may notice that there's a little more half marathon race pace thrown in, um, like on Sundays and Mondays or whatever, before we do the Rose Bowl half. So, okay, we've gone through all of that stuff before. Oh, changing groups. The best time to change a group would be during one of those tapers, right? And the reason for that, one of these interval tapers, and the reason for that is that your energy output, your power output is going up and up and up. If you also increase your intensity along with your volume, then your power output, your energy output is going up even higher because of you're going faster. So you don't want to increase your power output way too much more with both volume and intensity. You don't want to increase both suddenly, because then you can get injured. It's too much pounding, it's too much energy output, and you can get injured. The best time to do it is when you're dropping volume, and then you can increase intensity, meaning increase speed, because you're not going as far. Your total energy output for that workout will actually be less, even though you're going faster. So that's the best time to change groups and go to a faster group. You can go to a slower group anytime you want to. So that's it. Um, and also, yeah, like I said, do not jump into speed and jump into distance. It's too much. And early season, you definitely want to work that aerobic base as you're about to find out more and more from the history of theory of training. So, something most of you probably never even heard of. A guy named Dr. Tudor O. Bompa, PhD. I'll just read this really quick. This is, by the way, his sixth edition of his book on periodization, The Theory and Methodology of Training. I did not read this, but the most recent one is the sixth edition. If you want to dive into something that's really intense and I'm told somewhat boring, he revolutionized Western training methods when he introduced his groundbreaking theory of periodization in his native Romania in 1963. After adopting his training system in the Eastern Bloc, meaning Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc countries dominated the international sports through 1970s, 80s. In 1988, Bompa began applying his principles of periodization, the sport of, hear this one out. He applied it to the sport of bodybuilding. Now, this guy had nothing whatsoever to do with running. He was a strength coach, as you're about to hear in the next little segment here. Periodization is a structured approach of planning and managing training programs by dividing them into specific phases or cycles. We just had that example a few seconds ago. Each with a unique focus and intensity, optimize performance, and prevent overtraining. But he was not talking about runners. His theory and methodology of training had to do with building strength. And he actually did go on, he did coach several Olympic strength builders, Olympic strength guys, these guys who lift these massive volumes of weight. That was his thing. That's what in the Soviet Union and Romania, that's what he was paid to do, not running at all. So the entire theory, the point of all this is the entire theory of periodization wasn't even based on running. It had nothing whatsoever to do with pace. Running wasn't even a theory, a thinking, a plot point. It had to do with strength training, but doing different things like increasing volume, just like we do with running, and then cutting back and having periods of taper and then increasing more. And he would do heavy weights with fewer repetitions and build more and more repetitions over week after week. And then he would cut back, have a taper week, and then he would start building with high reps with low weight, right? So doing different things during different phases or periods of time to achieve different things. In this case, it was to basically, in most cases, shock the muscle. And as with us runners, we are also shocking our muscles and our endurance ability by going more and doing different things in different periods of time. But again, I want to point out the whole theory never discussed pace. Pace has nothing to do with it. I want to emphasize that. So I know we have pace leaders, we have pace groups, we have, oh my God, it's too much. But pace, we have pace watches. Keep in mind, 25 years ago, when I first joined the Roadrunners in 2000, actually in 2000, there were no pace watches. I remember seeing a guy wearing a hat, a scientist, and he had a hat with a little antenna on his hat and a wire that went through his shirt to a wristwatch. And he was able to triangulate satellites with this thing on his head. It looked so ridiculous. And he could get pace and distance. Nobody had that. It was only about a year or so later, maybe 2 years later, when Nike introduced the first pace distance watch that anyone had ever heard of. We all went out and bought it, but training principles had nothing to do with that whatsoever. If you were a true pro athlete and you wanted to know your heart rate, which had a lot to do with heart rate, again, utilizing fat at a low heart rate, utilizing carbohydrate more at a higher heart rate, those things were critical. And in order to know what you were focusing on in any run, they would take heart rate by putting their two fingers next to their carotid artery and look at their wristwatch and count for like 10 seconds how many beats they had in 10 seconds, multiply it by 6, and they knew what their beats per minute was. That was until, 23 years ago, that was the methodology that pro athletes went by. It was not pace. They didn't know really what the pace was. Okay, yes, they would drive their car 1 mile. When they hit 1 mile, they would kind of know after looking at their wristwatch, they would know what their 1 mile pace was. But, that was not really an easy thing to do. You couldn't do 2 mile or 3 mile or 4 mile, whatever. So that was Tudor Bumpa, who is probably I know he's in his 90s now. I believe he's still alive, and I'm almost positive he's now last heard living in Canada. And but this is his most recent edition, Periodization, Theory and Methodology of Training. I actually have a book by him on strength building for athletes. And it's very interesting. And it talks about all the periodization techniques and all that stuff. But I do actually have a book by him. At any rate, then along comes about the same time in the 60s, a guy named Arthur Lydiard, who had no clue what the hell he was doing. No idea, except for one problem. See, this guy used to love, he was a runner when he was younger, and he was a very successful runner when he was younger. And he found that if he went out on these long runs and did like 100 miles a week, keep in mind, pro athletes who want to win a marathon today are doing more like 140 miles, maybe even a little more. But back then he found if you peaked, if you built up through these training principles more and more and more that he created, which are over here, I'll go through really quickly. But this little pyramid of training concepts, very similar to Tudor Bumpo with strength training. I don't know if he heard of him in the 60s and whatever, but he created this idea where he would go out with all these athletes and they would run this long distance in the plains. He was from New Zealand, in the plains, and they could all be heard laughing and carrying on and having a great time. And man, they weren't really focused on pace. They were just low heart rate, going long distance, 10, 20 miles in a clip and 100 miles per the week. And lo and behold, a lot of his guys were getting into the Olympics, and a lot of his guys were getting gold medals. And he was suddenly in demand around the world for people who were winning Olympic medals. Our former coach, Rod Dixon, his brother was an Arthur Lydiard. Rod is from New Zealand. His brother was an Arthur Lydiard disciple. His brother became a coach using the Lydiard method. And so he coached Rod based on the Lydiard method. And Rod became one of the top 5K runners in the world. He beat Steve Prefontaine in his day on several occasions. There's some video if you click on YouTube and search for Rod Dixon, Dixon. You'll see him at Madison Square Garden beating Steve Prefontaine by a lot on a 5K on an indoor built track. And he he knew Arthur Lydiard very well and met him many, many times. But these guys would just go out and run and have a fun time. It had nothing to do with pace. Again, in the 60s, they didn't have a pace distance watch. I do remember Rod telling me his brother they'd go a long strip of the highway in New Zealand, which was basically like a 2-lane road. I remember him telling me, and he'd get to the top of a little hill where his brother had parked the car waiting for him to get up. And he would get to the top of the road where his brother was, little hill, and his brother would stop him and say, "Take your heart rate." So he'd look at his watch and he'd take his heart rate and he'd tell him what it was. And he'd say, "Okay, you see that long distance for miles that you just ran?" And Rod would say, "Yeah." He said, "That whole distance you just went was a total waste of time because your heart rate was way too high. You weren't effectively utilizing fat as a resource for fuel. So it had nothing whatsoever to do with pace. It had to do with heart rate." Now, look at this little Lydiard method pyramid here. And I might as well read you this. New Zealand, in the 1960s, New Zealand's Arthur Lydiard introduced the concept of jogging, meaning low heart rate. The definition of jogging is any slower in your walking, to the world and sparked a global revolution toward fitness and well-being. The group religiously trained 100 miles per week, which I already mentioned. Arthur Lydiard's training method, a cornerstone of modern running. This is where all of our periodization schedules and everything we do pretty much comes from. It is said that you either love Arthur Lydiard or you hate Arthur Lydiard, but you are doing Arthur Lydiard. I mean, it's a kind of running joke from coaches, but it is so true. At any rate, he was the cornerstone of modern running, emphasizing building a strong aerobic base, which I'll touch on in a moment, through high volume, long distance running, followed by hill training, speed work to develop both endurance, meaning low heart rate, and speed, meaning high heart rate, right? So if you look at the pyramid, the big base of the pyramid, which we call base training, base building phase, 5 to 10 weeks, although this is altered slightly these days. You'll note we get a lot of aerobic base training throughout the season. Unless you were a total beginner and I was giving you an individual schedule and I didn't think you could handle a lot of speed work early on, then you would only get like 5 to 10 weeks of nothing but base building, low heart rate aerobic work. But in our schedules, we mix in a little bit of both, like the 80-20 concept, 80% aerobic work throughout most of the season, 20%, maybe a little more speed work, whatever, or somewhere thereabouts, depending on the schedule you're on. Uh, then after about 2 months, Arthur Lydiard would have people do hill repeats where you run up a hill and run down, run up the hill and run down, up and down and up and down. And you do that for 2 to 4 weeks. Well, we throw in hill training. We build up, we have a taper, and then we start in with hills. And we were last year pretty good with maintaining hills. Um, and that seemed to be a pretty good methodology. This year, unfortunately, our hills burnt to the ground, which is reality. Sad, very sad. Then anaerobic development, you don't want to just do speed work the whole time for 2 to 4 weeks. Like I said, we mix that in the whole thing. Then you integrate, and then taper 1 to 2 weeks. At the end, we now know 2 weeks is more efficient. The minimum of 2 weeks at the end for a marathon, half marathon, even 5K, 10K, depending on your volume. You can benefit from 2 weeks of taper. Like I said, also for a marathon, 3 weeks. A lot of you need 3 weeks. Our fastest runners get about 2.5 weeks, not quite 2.5 weeks, because the theory is they recover more quickly. And then there's a peak that you have for 1 or 2 weeks, which we do have as well integrated into our schedules. We peak at the great volume of work, and then we have our taper right after that. So you can see all of these things, all of these theories really have nothing whatsoever to do with pace. Pace really only became a kind of a catch thing in like 20, 23 years ago, if even, when, after Nike came out with a watch, then Garmin came out with a watch, and I still have mine. I should have shown it to you, but it's this big clunky watch that sat about that big on your wrist, and it was heavy and it banged around on your wrist, and it would only do stopwatch, pace, distance. That was it. That's all it did. No elevation, no recovery time, no sleep, no nothing. No energy output, no nothing. Carbohydrate depletion, none of that. Calculating finish time for marathons, half marathons, 10K, 5K, none of that. So really, that became a new thing that really didn't have any science behind it. It was just this cool watch that everyone could look at and say, oh my God, I went that fast. Or, oh my God, I went that many miles. But truly, if you look at the training principles and the concepts behind training and where it all came from, for one thing, it didn't even start with running. It started with strength building for the Olympic athletes, where Tudor Bumpo was able, the Soviet bloc owned athletes, and they could do a biopsy of the muscle and really study, which is where we have a lot of our science from today about aerobic work, meaning building capillary veins and arteries, mitochondria, oxidative enzymes. A lot of that stuff came from his studies and studies in the Soviet Union, where they owned their athletes. And either you give a muscle biopsy which takes a couple days to heal. You know, they're cutting into you sort of in a very small way, but still, or you're fired. You know, you had to succumb to whatever the Soviet bloc scientists wanted to do to you. And at any rate, we actually even saw some of that with Chinese athletes even more recently, which is unfortunate. But fortunately, we did gain a lot of knowledge from that group, and Tudor Bumpa brought it to, you know, when he defected, brought it to the Western Bloc countries. So with that, I say, as I always do, train smart and train to win. Because if you don't, you won't. And if you do, you just might. And stop focusing on pace. And with that, I say, I thank you. I will see you all at the finish line. I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to stop the recording. So, but for those of you who are watching on live Hangout, we'll answer all of your questions and more. Um, for those of you watching the recording, good night. Thank you for watching. Take care, everybody. Bye.